Today I'm going to make shepherd's pie. In its simplest form, this classic dish is just tender meat in rich gravy, topped with mashed potatoes and baked in the oven. And I won't be straying very far from that. This dish might be Irish or British in origin, depending on who you ask. Regardless, it's today firmly embedded in the British menu, and deservedly so. Let's get started. I'm using mutton for this dish. Lamb is meat from a sheep that's up to 1 year old. Mutton is typically from sheep over 2 years old. Between 1 and 2 years it's apparently called hogget, but nobody seems to sell hogget. I've never seen it anyway. Mutton is usually darker in colour than lamb and has a deeper, more robust flavour when cooked. It's sometimes thought of as tough, but the long cooking in this dish will take care of that. If you can't get mutton or lamb where you live, you could use beef. Some might say that technically you'd be making something called cottage pie, not shepherd's pie, but interestingly that distinction is actually a recent one in the history of the dish. In the past, cottage pie or shepherd's pie could be made with either beef or lamb. Nobody cared much about the semantics, and they didn't have people on the internet to tell them they were doing all the words wrong. If you do use beef, you might want to swap out some of the herbs and spices, although most of the flavours I'm using here would also go pretty well with beef. I'm just roughly deboning the mutton chops. The meat I will dice into small pieces. You can make this dish with minced or ground meat, and that's more common, but I feel like making it with little chunks today. The lean parts are easy to slice up. These pieces here with connective tissue are easier to cut up with poultry shears, I find. Now it might seem gross to be eating this stuff, but it will practically dissolve into the sauce during cooking, and if you bought minced or ground meat, you'd be getting these bits in there anyway, just ground up. I'll toss the meat in a bit of flour, which will later help to thicken the gravy, and add it to a pan with a little bit of oil and butter to fry off. The bones go into a big pot to make stock for the gravy. I've got a really big onion, which I'm going to peel and dice. Big onions make me really happy for some reason. The onion trimmings go in the stock pot. That might look like rather a lot of onion going in there with the mutton, but it's going to cook right down, trust me. Once the meat has started to cook, I'm going to add a clove of garlic, just roughly chopped. Some fresh thyme, about a level teaspoon of ground cumin. Cumin is a lovely spice for lamb or mutton. A crumbled stock cube. I managed to find lamb cubes, but any kind of stock cube would do. That's going to give us a lot of the salt we need for browning and seasoning the meat. The rest of the salt is going to come from these. Anchovy fillets. Just 2 or 3 of these little salty strips of fish will just dissolve into the sauce. Now, you might think this would make the meat taste fishy. It really won't. What it will do is to contribute salt and glutamates for a massive savoury punch. This is the part where someone tells me I mean to say umami. Sure, if you like. Savoury is also a word. For a beef-based pie, you could add bovril or marmite maybe instead of the anchovies, or maybe Worcestershire sauce. A spoonful of tomato puree could also go in now, but I didn't bother on this occasion. While that's cooking, I've also got these spring onions, which you might know as scallions or green onions. I don't need them until later on, but I'll trim off the root ends now, so I can also throw those into the stock pot. So also into the stock pot goes a stick of celery, which I've smashed up with my rolling pin to get the flavours out. A couple of bay leaves, actually 3. Sprigs of rosemary, sage and thyme. A smashed clove of garlic, a little pinch of salt and about a litre of water. I'll bring this to the boil, then turn the heat down until it's just bubbling along. Then cover with a lid and simmer for at least an hour. About 15 minutes later, the meat is cooked and starting to show little bits of crisp browned edges now. I'll add some nice open cap mushrooms. The stalks will go into the stock pot. The caps, chopped up finely, go into the meat pan as it continues to cook. Again, this might look like a lot of mushrooms, but it will cook down. Some liquid will come out of these mushrooms and the contents of the pan will boil and simmer for a while. We'll keep on cooking over a medium heat until all of that moisture is boiled off and we can hear frying again. I'll keep frying gently, stirring once in a while, until I can really clearly see caramelised edges on the meat and onion pieces. These little caramelised bits here translate to flavour in the finished dish. The meat I used was pretty lean. If you're using a fattier cut or ground, now's the time to skim off any excess fat, but don't throw it all away. It can be used later for making additional gravy. I've also got some of my dried foraged wild mushrooms. Before I started, I put a handful of these into about a cup of water to rehydrate. An hour or 2 later, they've softened and released a lot of flavour into the water. The liquid goes into the pan, except the last few drops, which sometimes contains a little bit of grit. This liquid will loosen up the meat and vegetable mixture, which might also benefit from a sneaky ladle out of the stock pot. The stock isn't actually finished just yet, but it has more flavour than water. You could absolutely add a splash of red wine or brown ale here if you wanted to. The rehydrated mushroom pieces also, of course, aren't wasted. I'll just chop them up finely and put them into the pan. So I'll cover that now and turn it right down until it's just very gently bubbling. Then simmer it for half an hour, maybe longer, until the meat is tender and starts to come apart when I poke it. During this time I'll keep an eye on it to make sure it's not boiling dry. Add a little more liquid if needed. One more thing I'll add now is a pickled walnut or 2, chopped into very small pieces. I made these pickled walnuts a couple of years ago and they're great for serving with cheese and crackers, but equally good as a kind of flavour booster in meat dishes like this. You could substitute a spoonful of your favourite pickle here, or a dash of brown sauce. Now for the potato topping. I've got some Maris Piper potatoes here. You can use any kind of potatoes you like for mashing. I'll peel them and cut them into pieces of more or less uniform size so they cook at the same speed. Some people like to leave the skins on for mash, and that's fine. I'm not doing that today. The skins will go in my compost bin, so nothing's wasted. I'll cover these with water in a large saucepan and boil them until they fall off a knife and break apart. I didn't add salt at the start of cooking because after draining them I'm adding a nice big chunk of butter. British butter today from the West Country, and this stuff is quite salty. It actually has visible crystals of sea salt mixed in. After mashing I'm also adding some milk and a little ground white pepper. Final taste for seasoning, adjust if necessary, and then set that aside to cool down a bit. The meat is also done now, so final taste there for seasoning too. And a little trick to create a base sauce for additional gravy, I'll add a couple of ladles from the stock pot. Then transfer the meat mixture out into an oven-proof dish using a pierced spoon, so some of the liquid stays behind. Again, I'll set that aside to cool down a bit, because this recipe is easier to assemble if the components are not scalding hot. I'll just scrub around this meat pan with a soft spatula to get all those tasty bits, and I'll reserve it right there. You'll see what this is for later. Once the potatoes have cooled down a bit, I'll chop up those spring onions and stir them through it, and then beat it a bit with a wooden spatula. It's still a bit lumpy, which I like, but this makes it sort of pliable. What I'm making here is almost like a version of Irish champ. I'll spoon it on top of the meat in smallish spoonfuls. If you just dump it all in one place, it will be difficult to spread out without mixing it into the meat and gravy. Smooth it to the edges, then rough it up on the top surface with a fork. You can make this dish in advance and cool it down once it's assembled like this, then chill it in the fridge and then warm it through in the oven the next day. Or wrap it up and freeze it. Just defrost it fully before reheating. But mine is being baked right now, so I'll just brush it with a little melted butter on the top here to help it go golden. Now from the thumbnail and title, you may already know this is a recipe collab with my friend Babatunde in Nigeria. We're heading in a slightly new direction for our recipe collabs now. Instead of trying to exactly replicate each other's recipes, which can be tricky for sourcing of ingredients, we're going to give them a little local twist. So more local ingredients, along with some local tweaking of flavours and styles. So please do head on over to Africa Every Day and see Babatunde's Nigerian take on shepherd's pie. It's different from this, and you might want to try it. Link is in the card and video description as always. In the near future, I'll also be reciprocating with an English twist on one of his African dishes. The pie goes into the oven at 180 Celsius for about 30 to 40 minutes. Maybe more like an hour if you're heating it from chilled, but we'll cook it until the top starts to crisp up and brown. You can add a bit of grated cheese before or halfway through baking. I personally like that on a beef-based pie, but not so much on one made with lamb or mutton. While that's baking, I'm just going to prepare some vegetables. Simple steamed carrots and peas. Some people actually add the peas in with the meat layer. I prefer them on the side. I'm cutting the carrots into large sticks, and I will steam them just to the point where they have a little bit of crunch still. The stock pot's still on the simmer, so it's not too late to throw those carrot peelings in for extra flavour. And the tops and tails, except for one which I'll give to this little bunny here. After another 20 minutes of cooking, the stock is ready to strain. Just look at that colour. Okay, most of that came out of the onion skin, but so did bags of flavour. The pie already has some gravy mixed in with the meat layer, but I like a bit extra to pour over. So let's make that now. If there's fat reserved from cooking the meat, you could use about a tablespoon of it here. There was no spare fat from mine, so yep, I'm using more butter. Then an equal amount of flour to make a roux, which I'll just gently fry off for a minute or two. Then I'll turn down the heat and add some stock. Give it a whisk, then add that reserved sauce and pan scrapings from the meat pan. I'll simmer this until it thickens to the required consistency. Still a bit thin for my liking here, so I'll just gently reduce it for a few more minutes. Just before serving, I'll stir in a teaspoon of mint sauce into this gravy. Mint is a classic flavour match for both lamb and for potatoes, so I think that'll be nice. Mint sauce is just chopped mint leaves preserved in sugar and vinegar. If you have fresh mint, you could use some of that chopped up and stirred in. If you're making a beef-based pie, maybe you could add mustard here instead. By the time the pie starts to brown on some of the potato edges, it will be done. You can cook it further than this if you want a really crispy top. It's also quite normal for the gravy to erupt in one or two places like it did here. That's why I put it on a metal tray before I put it in the oven. And there it is, shepherd's pie with steamed vegetables and gravy. A really lovely, hearty, tasty, classic British dish. And just a little bit of that minted gravy over the top and across those carrots. Superbly flavourful and warming. In fact, I normally think of this as more of a winter thing. And it's spring now, but there's a storm blowing outside at the time of serving this, so it really fits. I hope you enjoyed this version of the recipe. I really enjoyed eating it. Shepherd's pie is a dish with a long history, and as a result there are lots of subtle and not so subtle variations on it, so please let me know about yours in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.